Well, today we're going to talk about faith and how vulnerable faith is. Do you think faith is a vulnerable topic of conversation? Just something that's a little hard to get out sometimes? Somebody say, yeah. Yeah. It can be a little hard to get those words out. It feels a little clunky. You always feel like my hands start sweating, like what do I say? How do I talk about God and Jesus? And the Trinity's like three, but it's super like one, right? We get a little bogged down in those things sometimes. Well, it made me think of this time that I got invited to my theater group in high school. Got invited to participate in the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, Scotland, which is the largest international theater festival in the world. And we were super excited. We raised money for like a year and a half. All those car washes where people overpaid. We had a vending spot at what was called the ESA back then. You remember the ESA? No? Nobody remembers what it's called, the ESA? All right, great. And we raised all this money, and we get there. We get all the way there. And we stop by London, and in London we see some amazing shows, including going to the Globe Theatre and standing on the ground and watching a Shakespearean play right before us. And we're so inspired. And we get all the way to the Fringe Festival, and we realize we are out of our league entirely. We're high schoolers. These are professionals. There was this new movement in theater that was happening that year called Cirque du Soleil. The theater next to ours had a literal crane overhanging the stage because this woman got up on a sheet and it took her into the sky. We didn't know that was possible. And here we are thinking, why are we here? And then they drop the hammer on you. They don't tell you this in the brochure. But you have to build your own audience. You see, none of us had thought about that because when we play at home, our moms and our grandmas show up. But they didn't make the trip. We have no fans. So you have to do this thing, it's called barking. It's called barking because you stand on High Street, and if you ever see an interview with a comedian, they will tell you about the early years of being a stand-up comic, where they had to stand on the street corner 4, 5, 6 hours before their performance and beg people to come. And if you don't get enough people in comedy, you don't go on. So in our case, we had to stand on the street corner of this gorgeous road called High Street. At the top of it is a castle. If you want to feel like you're small in the world, try and bark on High Street. And everyone is there, all of the acts. And so over and over again, I felt so small, so insignificant. And people would come by and you'd get up the courage and you'd say, hey, would you like to? No. Hey, excuse me, sir, I know you're busy, but no. Hey, would you come here and you want to check us out? No. And finally, somebody will listen to your pitch long enough, and then you realize, I've got no pitch. All I was trying to do was get your attention. I had to back that up with something, and so you just start mumbling like words come out. And I realized that the show that we've brought to Edinburgh, Scotland for an international theater festival is sketch comedy. Do you know what sketch comedy is? It's like Saturday Night Live, okay? Right? But written by high schoolers in a foreign country. And we got really worried that our show wasn't going to translate, right? Because my jokes about how no one lives in the state of North Dakota doesn't land well in Edinburgh, Scotland. And so I realized that after a while, we were horrible. But after a while, we found a little bit of a groove. And I was astounded when later that afternoon, this family that I had talked to hours earlier showed up to our show. I couldn't believe that it worked. I couldn't believe that anybody wanted to come see our show. And mind you, our shows were not sold out by any means. But everyone who was there was invited by us because nobody was wandering into that theater unless we had invited them to do so. And just what made me start to realize, I've been thinking about it a lot this week when I think about Peter, and I think about this first Pentecost, this birthday of the church. Sometimes the first words that come out of your mouth aren't gold. Sometimes it takes a while to refine what it is that you're going to say. And I don't know if you're part of this pop culture movement, but there's a movement right now to take things that are not inspirational quotes and put them on fancy backgrounds like they look like inspirational quotes, right? And so think about the great speech openings that you know, right? 7 years ago, or I had a dream, or in the beginning. And then think about Peter's. These people are not drunk, as you might think, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. He's clearly never been tailgating with me or any of my friends, because you can do that. I don't recommend it over the age of 22, but you can. This is not the greatest sermon beginning that's ever been told. Okay? This is a really low bar to set. This is a man who followed Jesus around for years, who constantly heard from the man himself, who heard gospel, who heard truth, who saw people's pain be relieved. And the first words out of his mouth are, hey, trust me, we're not drunk because it's too early. I feel his resonance in my own faith journey because sometimes the words just don't come out quite that way. Eventually, Peter does get on to say something quite wonderful, and I've sort of translated it in the spirit of Taylor Swift. Maybe this is Daniel's version of what Peter says here in Acts 2. Essentially, he says, let me tell you about Jesus of Nazareth, who did a lot of good things. He was an excellent teacher. He healed people when other people passed by on the other side. And he was changing the world. And they killed him for his freedom work. Not because they thought he was a bad guy, but because they were threatened by what change to the system would do to them. They killed him. And they're not worse than us, because they basically are us. And he says, but even in the cross, we find that goodness simply cannot be killed. And that's good news for you too. Because love always survives. Even death on a cross. Even Jesus can bring peace, even as he shows you the holes in his hands. So I just want you to feel seen. If you feel like it's hard to give your faith story, I just want you to know that it's not easy to begin to open up around your faith. I just want you to know it's totally okay to have doubts, to have concerns, to not be able to articulate things, to feel small in a world of a lot of barking. But I also want you to know that your faith matters. I want you to know that people are watching the way that you live. And I want you to know that Peter started out pretty crummy and got better. And I want you to know that the church started before any of the writings of Paul, before Matthew, before Mark, before Luke, or before John were even born. I want you to know that people started by telling their own stories and finding their story in his story. And I want you to know that you don't have to have it all figured out to tell somebody about Jesus and his love. So my prayer for you this morning is a simple one. Simply to have faith in your faith. Can you advance that? It's not working for me. This is my big moment. Thank you. All right. Pretend you haven't heard it. Have faith in your faith. You don't have to have it all figured out. You see, there's this guy, Paul, and he wrote some really great things later in his writings. But if you go back and read the first thing that he wrote, 1 Thessalonians, who can quote it? None of you. You know why? It's not that good. But I bet you know Romans. That's the last thing he wrote. In the beginning, he's like, I want to tell you about this guy. There's like a lamb, and he's like, the blood, and we're like this, there's this like theology starting to come. And then when he gets all the way to his last book, which is Romans, he says, for I am convinced that there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. Not height, nor depth, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor anything else in all of creation can separate us from the love of God. He didn't start there, but he got there. So it is with us. Our faith is a living being. We are a living sacrifice. And what Christ wants for you on this birthday of the church is to have a little faith in your faith. It might not feel like anyone's listening, but I promise you, they will show up to hear your story. And when they do, they'll find good news for themselves also. Amen.